Bob Murphy Show, episode 490.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. Another crossover. This time we are doing a remembrance of Murray Rothbard and Roger Garrison. So Rothbard recently had the 100th anniversary of his birth. And Roger Garrison, a familiar staple at Mises University, longtime professor of economics at Auburn University, he passed away in February. And it took a couple of weeks for the news to reach, the Austrian community. And so we're taking some time in this episode to go over some of his major contributions. So by the end of this episode, you will learn or have learned a lot more about Austrian capital theory, if I had to, in the boom bust cycle, put it that way. I think you'll like it. Here we go.
Hi, Bob.
Hey, Adam.
I am so excited for our crossover episode this week, Bob. Do you know why?
No, I don't.
It's because this is one of those ones where I just get to sit here and ask you questions, and you do all the talking, and I don't have to impress anybody about poker or my very rudimentary understanding of philosophy and economics and history. I could just rely on them. It's all alley-oops. I'm just going to check them up near the backboard and rely on your athletic and academic prowess to put the ball in the hoop.
Okay, sounds good. I'm excited too.
Me too. So there's a couple of things we're going to talk about because there's a couple of events that occurred recently. One is the 100th anniversary of one Murray Rothbard's birth. He was born March 2nd, 1926, which seems like an incredible thing to me. And then on a much less happy note, recently a guy you knew, I think, fairly well from Mises Institute, Roger Garrison, passed away 3 weeks ago, I think, the middle of February. And since those two things happened, we're going to talk about them and some of their work and talk economics.
Yeah. So for Rothbard, I unfortunately never got to meet him. I remember I was at Hillsdale College, as an undergrad, and some kid came out up to me. He said, "Oh, hey, did you hear the news that some free market economist died?" And I just knew it was Roth. I said, "Was it Murray Rothbard?" He was, yeah, that was it. I was like, oh, and being a narcissist kid in college, I wasn't like, oh, too bad for him or his family. I was just like, oh, I didn't get to meet him and, tell him why he was wrong. And, that kind of stuff. Like, I wanted to see what his answer was. So anyway, that's how I was when I was younger. And then, Garrison, I knew, I could say we were friends that, certainly, colleagues and he had a wry sense of humor. We got the news, folks. It took a few weeks to break through. The furthest I traced it back was Larry White. I don't know if he was the one that announced it to the economist community, but somehow Larry White realized, I don't know how, that, oh wow, Roger Garrison passed. And, then once, of course, one person posted it on X, it went all over the place. This is us now responding to that. Just to give one, I'm trying to think of anecdotes. So we'll, in a minute here, folks, talk about his work. I think we've got some slides ready that will cover something from Rothbard just to give it a flavor of, some of his work from Man, Economy, and State. And that'll lay the foundation for, I'll go through Garrison's famous 3-panel diagram that people associate with his book and his PowerPoint presentations. But just a personal anecdote. I was I meant to check with him beforehand, Adam. I think it was with Gene Callahan that we were emailing. This was back when you would write long emails to people and like use punctuation and stuff. And
Remember?
It was weird. It was so anyway, young people won't know what that is. But we were arguing about, it was, I think it was, the issue was something like, what if everybody in the community wanted to save more in the form of cash balances? And like, so what would happen just mechanically if everyone just wants to, double the amount of cash they're holding, let's say. And you can think of it either as like everyone's holding, paper currency, or you can even think of it as gold coins. And the idea is like in the short term, whatever wants to hold more, double the gold coins that they're holding. And so there's different theories about what would happen. But even if the supply of money is static, what the typical, economistic response is to say, well, really what people care about is the real purchasing power of your money balances. It's not so much the nominal amount. And so what would happen is if everyone wants to double their cash balances, that, in the short term, that can't happen. Like you can't just dig up more gold or whatever, or, what if the government doesn't just print up more $100 bills? And so because people are trying to bolster their saving in the form of cash balances, they spend less. So then that makes prices fall. And so the idea is, if everything were symmetric, if prices fall in half, then the same amount of money now has twice as much purchasing power. So everybody would have now doubled their real cash balance. All right, so that's the kind of thing we were arguing about over email. And I believe Gene and Roger were taking the position that doesn't make the community better off in any sense. You know what I mean? Like that's sort of illusory. Like, in other words, each individual could think, oh, I did the wise thing. Now I'm better prepared to weather a financial storm or something because now I'm holding twice as much money as I was before, right? Like, oh, instead of having 1 month of savings, now I have 2 months of savings. And if the way that happened is that you had the same amount of money, but now prices in general fell in half, then you see how that works. And so I think they were trying to show that's an illusion because then let's say the financial storm hits, then that would just unwind. Everyone tries to spend down their extra saving and then all of a sudden prices double and you realize, oh crap, as opposed to if you accumulated more bottles of water and generators and stuff in your shed, right? So that's the distinction we were making. So anyway, it's not even important. I think I happened to be falling on the side of, no, they're actually, that process would release real resources somehow and the community really would be better off in physical terms somehow, like, to face an uncertain future. But whatever the reason, I wrote to Gene and Roger.
Making an argument based on just their savings now or forestalled spending being pushed forward into the future, that sort of a thing?
I think the mechanics of it was something like I was arguing, because Mises has something in Human Action about this too, but like it wouldn't just be a symmetric thing. Like, and I can't remember, to recapitulate all the details right now, but I think the idea was I was saying if people in general, because they wouldn't just necessarily cut back on all spending across the board, they would probably cut back on, things they could afford to get, So like spending on going out to restaurants would probably go down more than spending on insulin, right? I think that was maybe part of my argument or something. But in any event, I was trying to show that no, actually in any realistic scenario, this really would release some real resources that could then get diverted into making more generic intermediate goods that could be deployed based on whatever the uncertain future is, that kind of a thing. But that's interesting, but it doesn't really matter for the anecdote. So I'm emailing, again, we had this like three, people kept replying all, and so there's three of us going back and forth. And I said something like, no, I was thinking about it when I was taking a shower, and I think Roger's wrong because of that, and I typed it all up. And then Roger hit reply all and just wrote, I think Murphy needs to take another shower. And then, went on to explain why I was wrong. So anyway, that was perhaps way too long of me setting up that was, anyway, that it was a funny guy with a funny sense of humor.
All I heard is that economists fail to grapple with the essential matter, which is how does Scrooge McDuck get more units of currency he can dive into and swim around in? That's what we all want to know.
I think what he would do is he would put it in a cylinder that was deeper but narrower, and so the same volume of coins would give the illusion that he could dive deeper. All right, so that was good. So he, just for people to know, he was a professor at Auburn. His book is called Time and Money. It was like in the Routledge series. That's an academic tome, and Roger he had some decent publications like in mainstream journals, right? And anybody who talked to him would realize, like, oh, this guy's, he's a serious economist. Like even mainstream people would I'll get more specific when we get into it, but that's one way of explaining what is it that he did, because he had these fantastic PowerPoint presentations. I know that sounds funny to be saying, but we'll put the links, folks. But if you,
I saw them,
yeah.
They are
like and it was funny, like him being even years ago, like an older guy, like you're just not expecting him to get up there and make PowerPoints do things you didn't know PowerPoints could do. And anyway, so it was not just that he took the Austrian theory of the business cycle, because he was a macroeconomist, in the terms of the verbal exposition and human action and man, economy, and state, and then he made a cool PowerPoint. But he took it and presented it in his book, and he had a journal article too. He expressed the Austrian theory of the boom bust cycle using mainstream tools, let's say, or diagrams. Like, so if he put it in terms that a mainstream economist could say, oh, that's what you guys are saying. Like, they might not be convinced, but at least they would get, oh, that's what the claim is now. Whereas there was such a chasm between the way like Mises would write it in Human Action and then what you would learn in a standard economics PhD program. That, because I ran that too, that when I would try to explain the Austrian theory of the business cycle at NYU, like one guy just said, he was listening, he goes, oh, so it's an overinvestment theory. And no, it's a malinvestment theory. And, anyway, maybe one last bit, so I don't forget, is Garrison. He started out as an engineer. I should have looked it up before we started at it, but I think he may have gone all the way through and like actually gotten his undergrad degree in engineering, but I might be off. Like maybe he switched at some point, but at some point, he realized, oh no, economics is my passion. I got to switch. But he would say, and I think he has written that helped him, because in engineering, they really stressed, like if you're going to write an equation, the units have to match too. Like it's not just enough that the numbers work and that, it's this equals this times that, but make sure the units all match up too.
Mm-hmm.
And he's, especially in capital and interest theory, that insight is very important. So he argued that that's partly why he had such an edge over, his mainstream colleagues. Just to give an illustration of that, like Paul Krugman one time was arguing about, it was about taxing dividends or something. It's not that important, but Krugman was trying to make an argument, and he drew a diagram, and he had the interest rate on the y-axis, and on the x-axis it was like the quantity of capital or something. And he was trying to show that, at the lower interest rate, like more capital is of it. And I was just pointing out and saying, like, those units don't even really work, right? Or just in general, if you think that, oh yeah, it's as we save and accumulate and get more capital, then the equilibrium interest rate falls. And that doesn't really, it's like, well, no, making more tractors, the output of tractors would go, or the rental rate of a tractor would go down or something, like as the supply of tractors increases. And so what is that? Like it's, how much you pay per hour of tractor time or something, you know what I mean? So I'm just saying, when you got into it and you realize like the standard way economists talk about capital and interest, like the units don't even work. Don't get me wrong. Like if you wanted to, you could go back and like fix it all up or anything. But I'm just saying the words that would naturally pop out of their mouth, the units didn't even work. And again, people familiar with that stuff know I'm getting into like Bombarovic's critique of what he called the naive productivity theory of interest and everything. So anyway,
it's interesting. I didn't know that anecdote.
And now let's take a break for a totally organic conversation about a great company.
Hey, Bob. Remember the merch tables I saw the last time I tabled for the Libertarian Party? Everything went sideways for those guys.
Hard to forget, especially since you've told me 3 times already. What could those poor schlubs do to make things better?
I've been hearing great things about the Swan Brothers. They offer premium gear, embroidered polos, durable tees, and they'll set up a professional online store at no cost. They handle design, printing, and shipping end to end. Lots of options, too. Hats, mugs, bags, even branded socks. And if you run out of sizes on site, they provide a QR code so people can order and have items shipped directly.
That sounds amazing. Who else would that help?
Pretty much anyone. Startups doing promo, nonprofits fundraising, sports leagues outfitting teams, churches, you name it. Quick turnaround, fair pricing, and volume discounts. Take a look at theswanbrothers.com/cross.
Okay, organic conversation over. Back to the show.
And because I'm so pro-Austrian school, it just reinforces my belief that it's your methodology, our methodology, that's, methodologically true and impacts with the real world. That's why you make sure the units line up. Whereas, the Keynesians and even the neoclassicals, they're just sort of posturing with their models that don't make any sense. And so who cares if the units don't line up? We're making this up as we go along anyway.
Yeah, and it's also, just since we're given some random trivia here, that's also why Austrians have an affinity with some of the like Schraffians, or they might call themselves post-Keynesians, like the famous Cambridge Capital controversy. I am firmly in the camp of the UK Cambridge people who are associated with like Joan Robinson and stuff, who are, arch anti-capitalists, against, the Massachusetts Cambridge people like at MIT and whatever, that were like by Paul Samuelson and people like that. Even though in terms of ideology, I'm probably closer to Paul Samuelson than I am to, because the American Cambridge people, they were arguing for like marginal distribution theory, like, oh, workers get the marginal product of labor and capitalists get the marginal product of capital, and they just call that interest, right? And so they were trying to argue for the legitimacy or the fairness or the whatever comprehensibility of how incomes are determined in a market, because it has to do with marginal distribution and all that stuff, and whereas the people in the UK were. But when you actually read the arguments and whatever, even though ideologically, again, like I'm closer to the MIT people, Robinson et al. just blew them up. And like Samuelson even had to throw in the towel. And it's related to stuff we're talking about. It was like, just one example, like to try to like, it makes sense to say, oh, how many tractors do you have? And as you add more and more tractors, that reduces the marginal product of the last tractor, right? Like how much extra corn can you harvest by adding more tractors? There's diminishing returns or whatever. But then to extrapolate from that and to say, oh, so as you add more capital to the economy, then the interest rate has to go down or something. And that's kind of how they were trying to justify things. And that doesn't work because, among other things, like to add up to come up with the total capital, like the capital letter K for the economy, when you don't mean individual capital goods, but you just mean aggregate, what's the quantity of capital there, like you have to turn it into money, right? Like there's no other unit you could use or another thing. And so the problem is, if you want to add, up all the tractors and all the oil wells and blah, 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 and all the factories and things, like the actual building, and add them up into a dollar figure, you're necessarily using an interest rate, to capitalize the present value of that thing. Like that's how you know what's the market price of this farmland or something. If you're going to do with fundamentals, you'd like look forward and say, okay, what's the net yield going to be of, what I sell the crops for over and above the fertilizer costs and blah, blah, blah. And then that gives me a cash flow, and then I discount it to the present using some interest rate. So the point was there was kind of a circularity there. In other words, the mainstream models were just saying, oh, you take K and you take the production function, then out pops the equilibrium interest rate. And Joan Robinson, all that, were showing that, no, you're thinking of it in terms of physical things, but to actually do what you want to do, you already need to know what the interest rate is. And so when you write out the actual math in a more realistic and subtle model, there were some indeterminacies in there, right? So there's just stuff like that where the mainstream guys like had a simple fable of, oh, there's one good, like capital is just how many tractors are there or something, and then they would do the model in that and then just generalize to the real world and not realize there were some holes in it. Again, just kind of showing the importance of keeping your units straight and all that stuff.
This is totally unfair segue, but as you were talking about tractors, I was thinking, in the future, we're going to be talking about AI-driven robot tractors.
Yep.
Heck, we're pushing out the human labor element completely, if you believe some future theorists. And it just made me start wondering how economists of the future are going to think about the interplay of capital and labor and the production functions and all that. Do you think it's going to be radically different, or just yeah, of course, one person runs an entire series of robot factories, and what else would the distribution be?
Right. Well, let me say, so everything you need is like in Frank Fetter, right, to handle that world, like in terms of explaining.
That's great. That's good.
And let me just give it, in my doctoral dissertation, folks, this is what, 2003, one approach I tried to use that I swear to this day has not been fully appreciated is I was trying to knock down the standard idea that interest is the marginal product of capital, right? So most people, I mean, they could quibble about particulars, but most people are okay, like in the economics profession, are okay with saying wages are the marginal product of labor, right? Okay. And you might say it's fair or unfair, but there's, in a competitive equilibrium, workers get paid their marginal product. Okay. And so, again, this goes back to the debate I was talking about 2 minutes ago. So the people trying to justify the capitalist income were saying, oh, well, interest is the marginal product of capital. But notice, like, the flip there is like, well, wait a minute. What a capital good earns is the rental rate of that good. It's not the percentage return to a sum of financial capital. I see those are different things, and they were kind of conflating those things. But in any event, so one way I tried to motivate that, to get across, like, no, that doesn't even make sense, because you can you can explain prima facie how, yeah, clearly, the amount of extra harvest you get, even in money terms, from hiring, one more tractor, is the physical product of that capital good. And, what does that have to do with the percentage rate of return on how much money you spent buying the tractor, which is what the return would be on your investment financially, right? And then, but a way that, like, the sophisticated economist who doesn't want to drop their, what they were taught and the way they've been thinking about it for 30 years, they'll come back and be like, okay, yeah, sure, but in a steady state equilibrium, if the amount of money you would get from the yield and product that the tractor gives you, the marginal tractor, is higher than what it costs to build a new tractor, then they would keep doing that, right? In other words,
I was just about to ask you that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think they have a point, or?
Well, okay. And so I said, okay, yep, you're right. I can build a model and come up with a steady state and say that's true. And I said, but by the same token, if there are robots that can perform certain tasks identically to human workers, then I can also come up with a model and show in the steady state that that interest is the marginal product of labor. Right. And I said, now, and I can write a model where that's true, right? Because you would keep building more robots until on the margin, the rate of return on the robot was exactly equal to, the ratio of the price of the robot to the product that, the extra apples they're picking. The robots out there in the orchard picking the apples and putting them in baskets next to human workers. And, the wage rate of the human workers, we could calculate and say, oh yeah, that's because they're picking, $20 worth of apples an hour. So that's why they get paid $20 an hour. And then you say, oh, and what's the rate of return on the robot? Oh, it's 8%, because the $20 an hour, and based on, how much to build a new robot, and then how many hours of apple picking do you get out of it before you got to scrap it. And it turns out that's 8% return. So that's why when you say, why is the interest rate 8%? You say, because robots can pick this many baskets of apples per hour. That's why. So did I just show you that, interest is really, when you think about it, the marginal product of labor? And you say, no, you're mixing up. What the hell are you talking about? Yeah, you can come up with a model where that happens to be a knife at, and I'm saying, right, just like interest really isn't the marginal product of capital, even though you can come up with a model where, oh, well, if you keep investing in building more tractors in the steady state, you know what I mean? Because it's not just true in equilibrium. It's only true in a steady state where you're just replacing, the tractors that are wearing out every period.
So instead of saying interest is the return on capital, what would you say is the short, pithy understanding of what's going on?
What I said in my dissertation was interest is the exchange rate of present for future money.
Uh-huh.
And that was another thing, like why I critiqued the pure type-harvest theory of interest. And say we try to explain how come the dollar trades for so many yen. You wouldn't say, oh, because U.S. goods are preferable to Japanese goods. That would be, it's not just that's wrong. You'd be like, what kind of aggregation? Like I want to go vomit as an Austrian. U.S. goods are preferred to Japanese goods. You say, oh, why is it that $1 today trades for $1.05 next year? Oh, because present goods are preferred to future goods. And you're like, yeah, Austrian economics for the win. I was like, that should inspire the same revulsion. I was trying to do. This is kind of morphed into, hey, we got Murray Rothbard and Roger Garrison. Let's talk about my stuff. So
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why that keeps happening. You said you never met Murray Rothbard, and immediately it made me conclude, because it makes me happy to think this, that every time you and Tom Woods get together behind the scenes, he just lords that over you. I choose to believe that that's true.
there was a period where, I mean, he would bring it up. He told an anecdote one time at Mises U, you know, like we'd have you'd have the formal, you know, lectures, but then some of the years we'd have like the more, you know, take your tie off kind of, you know, after dinner stuff. And that was one Tom would open with that. He did it at least once. I think he probably did more than one, where he was saying how when he was younger, that he was at a conference and he came in, and then Rothbard was like, Tom, come over here. And like he said it in the room, and like, you know, so Tom looked around, everyone could hear him saying that. So yes.
So I think we've laid enough groundwork. We could do this in any order you like, but ladies and gentlemen, it's time for graphs and pictures and
Yep.
circular flows. So which order would you like to go in?
Let's do the Rothbard one first, because I can do that one isolated, whereas the Garrison thing.
I agree. I think that's wise. Should we start with the Keynesian circular flow and then show how?
Yep.
Okay.
So where we're going with this, folks, is Rothbard has a diagram in Man, Economy, and State, which is his magnum opus that I think it was 1962 that first came out. It was like he was going to go through human action and just make it a little bit more understandable and fill in some stuff, like, because Mises assumed the reader was a Renaissance man.
Right.
And so Rothbard was going to go through and kind of fill in some of the holes for people who weren't trained economists. And then that's what Man, Economy, and State ended up being. And so one of the diagrams we're going to get to in a minute here is like the stages of production. And when I used to teach that, I would tell my students, this is like the Austrian version of what a standard textbook would have as the circular flow diagram. So the circular flow diagram is pretty standard in regular mainstream texts. And so I'll explain this first, and then you'll see how the Austrian diagram includes everything that's in this, but then it adds a whole nother level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to briefly describe for our audio-only listeners what's on the screen here?
Some arrows and colors and letters.
That's all they need to know. Okay,
Yep.
Fire away.
That's the Keynesians for you. That's kind of not very helpful, am I right? All right. So, yeah, it's got two different
Tracks.
circles. Yeah, tracks. Yeah. And one is going clockwise, and that's the flow of money. And the other one's going counterclockwise, and that's the flow of goods and services, and then factor services. All right. And there's two main sectors. There's the households, and then there's the businesses. So the business is pretty standard, understandable what a business is. But the households, that houses, no pun intended, the people in their role as consumers, but also in their role as the owners of the factors of production. All right. And so what the circular flow diagram is showing is, money flows from households via the product market and then turns into revenue for the businesses, right? So the households spend money on the products, and then, going the other way, you see goods and services, that red arrow, right? So the households spend money giving it over to businesses, who then perceive that as incoming revenue, and the businesses sell finished goods and services to the households. Okay. But then what do the businesses do with that money? Oh, well, they spend it to go to the resource or factor market, and they hire land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And then they make payments of that money, and that flows to the owners of the factors in the form of wages, rent, interest, and profit. Okay, so that's, there you go. That's the circular flow diagram. And what does that do? Like it's nice because it kind of shows that the money's just moving, it's just changing hands and moving around. Like even if we had just a static quantity of money that would just keep changing hands and moving around the economy, it's not that like the money's coming in somewhere and then going out somewhere. You know what I mean? Like it's just moving, changing hands, and it's showing that, the businesses have to hire the workers and pay rent to the owners of the land, and people are selling them coal or whatever. They got to pay the owners of the mines for their resources, and that stuff gets physically transformed into TV sets and cars and whatever, and sold to the consumers. But this diagram's kind of neat. That's kind of showing you the rhythm and the way that everything's interrelated, and how is it that the households can afford to buy the finished goods and services? Oh, because they're also the suppliers of the inputs to the businesses. And how can the businesses afford to pay them rent and wages? Well, because they sell the products for revenue. That's how. All right. So there you go. That is what it is.
Before we move on, as far as this goes, does every school of economics think what's being presented here is true?
I mean, I've actually never thought of that. Everybody would acknowledge it's simplistic and it's leaving out, like I'm sure the MMT people might say, well, how's the money getting in there? And stuff like that. And, the Marxists might be saying, well, if people are being ripped off, that, there's a parasitic class that's getting.
And where's government
getting a flow
fix
of
all
consumption,
this?
right? Getting a flow of consumption goods, even though they're not contributing anything valuable.
Right.
People could quibble about stuff that this is leaving out, but in terms of the basic story this is trying to get across, I think most people would say, yeah, that's okay insofar as it goes.
Cool. Yeah, I figured that was the answer. Correct, but missing things that certain schools or ideologies would think is of critical importance. Shall we move along?
Yes.
All right.
Okay, so this is actually from my study guide to Man, Economy, and State. As you can see there in the bottom for those looking at the video, I'm saying, this is figure 1 from page 369, right? So this is from my study guide saying I got this from figure 1 from page 369 of Rothbard's book. So the way this one works is it's showing the various stages in producing a finished consumer good. So I'll use it's been so long since I looked at Rothbard's text. I don't remember if he uses this example or if I am, but it's pretty standard when you're doing like these stages of production thing to use a loaf of bread as like the finished consumer good. So at the bottom there, the finished consumer good that's going into the hands of the ultimate consumer, let's assume, are loaves of bread. And the 100 ounces, that's not saying 100 ounces of bread. It's saying 100 ounces of gold are spent by all the consumers buying the stockpile of finished loaves of bread from the grocery stores.
That's a lot of bread, Bob.
Well, it is. It's a wealthy economy because they have a gold-baked, gold money. Okay? So what we're going to do here is, just like with that circular flow, that was kind of showing every period this happens. And you can just see how everything balances together and everything. So likewise here, I'm going to explain all these components. But the idea is this is just like a steady state. This pattern just going to keep recurring period after period. And you see the rhythm. Okay. So that's what that bottom row means. And then now it's easier if we start at the top. So that at the top there, it's like the farmers are planting wheat that's then going to take a period to harvest and, hand the raw harvested wheat over to the next guy. And so assume it takes 19 ounces of gold, to pay the farmer. So they plant the wheat and then, they got to maintain themselves for a year or whatever the period is. And then the harvest happens and then they hand the wheat over to those people, and those people can sell it to the next stage for 20 ounces of gold. All right. And then the capitalist of the next stage who buys the wheat for 20 ounces of gold, he also kicks in an additional 8 ounces of gold, hiring other workers who then grind the wheat into flour. Okay. And then the next period, they sell the finished flour for 30 ounces of gold. All right. And then that whoever paid the 30 ounces of gold for the flour then pays another 13 ounces hiring bakers to take the flour and put water with it and bake it into, loaves of bread that haven't been cut yet. Okay, so that's the way it works. And then, at each stage, then more stuff, the bread gets sliced and it gets put in bags and put on trucks and driven to the grocery store, right? So the idea is that you start with the raw, pure gift of nature of wheat shooting out of the ground, and then that keeps getting handed off to the next stage, who takes those intermediate goods, augments it with more inputs of raw labor power and other natural resources to make it, closer to the finished thing, and then they hand it off the next stage, and that's how it works. So once you get that whole chain up and running, like it takes 5 or 6 periods to get it, the pipeline full, but so long as, the farmers keep planting the wheat and everybody keeps doing their piece and handing it off to the next person, you can get a nice rhythm once the whole thing's up and running, and then that just keeps repeating. So that's now what we're looking at, assuming that this has already been up and running, and now we're just looking at it. And so the way this works is, like you can see the 20 and the 8 there, that turns into the 30. And so the idea is the guy at that stage who got the raw wheat and spent 20 for it and then spent an additional 8 ounces, hiring the services of the miller and then sold it for 30, so he spent 28 total, right? He spent 20 getting the wheat and then spent another 8. So his upfront expenditure was 28. He then had to wait 1 period to sell the finished flour for 30. So that 2 that you see flying off to the left there, that's because it's 30 minus 28, right? And then if you look at the next one, the next guy, he had to spend 43, the 30 and the 13, and then he sold it for 45, right? So that's how those rectangles all fit together. And so that's where that guy got to. And let's do one more so you see the pattern. So that guy spent 45 getting the thing from the prior stage. He spent an additional 12 on labor and natural resources. So that's 57. And then he waited a period and sold that for 60. So that's why 3 flows to the left. Okay, so and where those numbers are coming from is Rothbard was assuming there was a 5% rate of return on your investment, but he rounded, right? That's why they're not decimal places. Okay, so the idea is in this economy, there's a general 5% rate of return. So if you look at everybody at each stage and how much gross investment does the person have to put up front compared to then they sell whatever, that stage produces is the finished product to be carried forward, that gap in, their upfront price versus what their selling price is to the next stage, that gap is about 5%, and that's their interest income, right? And so then when you do that and you step back and you say, okay, so all the arrows flowing to the left, if you add them all up, that adds up to 17, and all the arrows shooting up, if you add those up across, that adds up to 83. Oh, and lo and behold, 83 plus 17 is 100. And that's not a coincidence. So here, Rothbard's just decomposing it and showing with these numbers that he chose, the capitalists earn every period a total of 17 ounces of gold worth of interest payments. And so that's how they have the ability that they can go to the store and buy 17 gold ounces worth of bread, whereas the owner of the, the farmland and the baker and the miller and the other workers, they all collectively get 83 ounces of payments, either, for their land or their other natural resources or for their labor power. And that's why they have every period 83 ounces of gold of income to go to the store and buy that much worth of bread, right? So it all adds up. But so you can, see, the payments of everybody, one person's payment is another person's income. So that's true here. So that's the kind of stuff that the, circular flow diagram had. But here you see the time element, whereas the circular flow diagram, there was no time.
Right.
Whereas here you can see the distribution. And then in particular, the last thing I'll say on this one, unless you want to ask questions, the reason I love this example is I would explain to the students, once I got them to understand how to read this thing, and I would say, in this economy, the standard GDP formula, that GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. I said, what are the components of the, of GDP in this economy? Well, first of all, what is GDP? And then what are the components? And so the correct answer is GDP here is 100 ounces of gold, and it consists of 100% of consumption spending. And there's no investment spending in terms of contributions to GDP in this diagram. And that seems odd because you'd say, what are you talking about? If you add it up, there's 318 ounces of investment. You know, like the first guy, you know, spends 19, then the next guy spends 28, and the next guy spends 43, right? If you're adding it that way, it adds up to 318. And then there's only 100 ounces of consumer spending. And and I'm telling you, in the way the standard GDP formula works, you don't count those intermediate stages. That would be considered double counting.
Right.
What the I means in the GDP formula is net investment. Here, it's 318 ounces of gross investment. And so, and this is one, like Mark Skousen harps on this, but I think that's one of the problems of standard GDP accounting.
Yeah.
When you hear that consumption spending is like 70% of the economy, in this setting, they would say it's 100%. And just to see how misleading that is, because here, let's take one example. The guy who every period sells his thing for 60 ounces, he's only allowed to spend 3 on buying consumer goods with that 3. He's got to take the other 57.
Yeah.
It takes him 45 to buy whatever the thing was from the prior stage, you know, like maybe bread that hasn't been cut up yet or something. And then he's got to spend an additional 12 hiring more workers or whatever to chop the, you know, slice the bread and put it into bags or whatever. But if he just decided to blow the 60, he could do that. But then all of a sudden there'd be a hole in the pipeline that 2 periods later would manifest as all the grocery store shelves would be empty. Right? So you see how it's important for gross investment to happen in this. Otherwise, the whole system breaks down. But yet the standard accounting would look at that and say, oh, this economy is driven 100% by consumer spending.
Right. Yeah, and it also seems like accounting for it this way means you could have an economy that's hollowing out its capital structure, and you wouldn't necessarily see it in the aggregate numbers, which seems like very descriptive of what's happening right now.
Yeah, perfect. That's why I wanted to do this first, because then it'll help set the stage for Garrison's diagram. So yeah, exactly right. This, once you see how this works, then you can tell the story of the Austrian theory of the boom bust cycle. And how could it be that, if investment in the earlier stages is screwed up, that things might seem good for a bit, but it takes a while for that work to work. You know, it's like here, if the guy at the third, you know, the second step there that you know, normally would spend 30 getting the stuff from the prior stage and then spend an extra 13, you know, hiring more people to work on the goods in process. If he went and did the wrong thing, like especially, let's say he spent, instead of spending 43, what if he spent 50 investing in something else that was wrong? That would actually show an increase in investment spending, and that might boost GDP and look like, oh, that's great. And he, you know, especially if he's bidding workers away from somewhere else, you know, wages would go up and everything. But if what he was doing actually didn't sync with the rest of the capital structure, that would pose a problem, but you wouldn't notice it until 4 periods later.
Right.
Because that's the lag from when he does what, you know, when he deviates from what he's supposed to do to when that actually has an impact on what shows up on the grocery shelves.
So yesterday you posted these 2 graphs and said, in celebration of the 100th anniversary of Rothbard's birth, I wrote a post explaining why the Austrian stages of production diagram featured in Man, Economy, and State is superior to the textbook, quote, circular flow diagram. And you've already explained how it is superior, but I was wondering if you could say that in a pithy way, just to underscore all that. Why is this better than the circular flow? What are we seeing that's not in the other thing?
Yeah, so the circular flow diagram, like I said, it is useful, and it captures the fact that one person's spending is another person's income, and that money, in a sense, just flows around performing its services. And it shows how the households are both consumers and the suppliers of the factors of production. But that's kind of all it captures. And I'm saying the Austrian diagram, once you understand how to read it and what it means, captures all that too, right? Like the 83 plus the 17 added up to the 100. Like, so you see, oh yeah, the income's paid to all the owners, including the capitalists have to. But the Austrian stages of production, I think, shows much. It incorporates time, so there's that element, but also it gives a better breakdown of why is it that the capitalists are earning income, right? In the circular flow diagram, it was just, one of the payments is interest, and you know, to capital, but it's not clear. You know, like physically, yeah, you can understand why the factory, you know, needs workers to show up, and it needs, you know, copper, and it needs barrels of crude oil to refine into gas. You know what I mean? Like, you can understand physical stuff flowing in the factory and then TV sets and cars coming out the other end. But to say, oh, and you need capital to flow in, and that's why they pay interest, it's not clear. Like, you can see why socialists would look at that.
Yeah,
and be
come
like,
along and just erase that part.
Yeah,
what
like,
do we need that
do?
for?
You don't need that. Whereas in the, the Austrian time structure production diagram, it's clearer, at least. Oh, what the interest actually is the gap between like what the the start of the period prices were for all the inputs, and then a period later, or at the end of that period, when you sell the more ripened goods in process to the next guy in line, you're actually charging a higher price than you originally paid, and that's the source of interest income. All right, so that's like, I think it helps explain the time element, and it's true that doesn't pin down that why is the interest rate 5% and not 8 or 2, but it does kind of show how interest has something to do with the time
how
element.
it works. Yeah, exactly.
It's not just like, you need electricity in order to do this, and that's why that's one of the inputs. That's not.
Very nice. Let us move on.
Let me put it this way too: it would be hard in the circular flow diagram to explain an unsustainable boom. Like, how would you depict? Like, you could you could show, what if the businesses made a bunch of stupid stuff, like bags of broken glass, like that Dan Aykroyd skit. It's a brand of glass. The kids love it. No.
It's got a label
like,
right
would
there.
Be dumb,
it says, hey,
but,
kid, don't cut yourself.
Yeah, but that wouldn't be an unsustainable boom. That would just be if they misforecast what the consumers wanted and they wasted resources. But it wouldn't explain, how could things actually look more prosperous for a few periods, and then all of a sudden you'd realize there was a crisis. How would you show that in a circular flow?
I think they'd just use a different color for that in the arrows, just like black or something.
Yeah. But whereas with the, like I said, that structure production one, you could see it just like as I was saying.
Right,
what if somebody at stage 2 did the wrong thing? It would take, a few periods for that issue to move down the pipeline.
Absolutely. I wish we had Roger Garrison's animated PowerPoint presentation. I guess we're just going to have to make do with this.
And by saying you wish, you mean like you had downloaded? Because it was the link I sent you, it was there.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
I just got this.
To be clear, I wasn't telling you to get the PowerPoint. I just wanted you to get this, and I'll just go through the bit what I'm saying.
Well, then when I say wish, I mean the absolute opposite of wish, because I wasn't going to do that.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
What I'm saying, Bob, is I was lying.
It's like you say the genie, I wish for a world where I had the ability to get that. And he said, boom, nothing's changed. Exactly. Okay. So to be clear, folks, this crazy PowerPoint that we're talking about, you can still get them at, we'll put a link at the website. But anyway, let me just explain. So this, again, his, I think he had a journal article where what he called it was, he didn't call it Austrian capital theory. He called it capital-based macroeconomics, which I thought was a good way to package it. You know what I mean?
Right. And here on the slide, it's the macroeconomics of capital structure.
Yes. Talking
about time and money.
Yep. And then let me just mention, so he has a journal article. So it was the Journal of Macroeconomics, 1984. And the title of Garrison's paper is Time and Money, the Universals of Macroeconomic Theorizing. Let me just read the abstract of this. It's just a few sentences. A broad overview of the macroeconomic literature suggests that two objects of economizing behavior, time and money, are the universals or common denominators of macroeconomic theory. Explicit recognition of these universals allows for a fruitful comparison of Keynesians and monetarists. The former tend to deny the possibility of a market solution to macroeconomic problems, while the latter tend to deny the problems themselves. Austrian macroeconomics, which consists of an integration of capital theory and monetary theory and lies between these two extreme positions, is used to assess recent developments in the mainstreams of macroeconomics. All right, so that was a very dense distillation of what he's trying to do here, and I think I partly wanted to read that just to show what Garrison's enterprise was. So he's just real quickly, let me unpack that. So I think everyone understands when Garrison's saying the Keynesians deny the possibility of a market solution to macroeconomic problems, right? Like Keynes famously in his 1936 general theory, one of the things he did in there was to show, he claimed, how there could be large-scale unemployment in equilibrium, right? That in terms of a classical school, especially like depending on what you mean by Say's law framework, it should seem like, no, it can't be that there's a glut of labor in the long run, right? Like if there's a bunch of workers and they want to work for the prevailing wage rate and they're able-bodied and they're interchangeable with the existing workers, like why wouldn't the businesses just hire them and lower the wage rate until the point at which, wages are coming down, so businesses want to hire more workers, and then fewer people want to work because the wages go down until you get equilibrium, and then there's no more involuntary unemployment. And Keynes came up with a way of trying to show that no, you could have persistent, large, so-called involuntary unemployment, and there's no inbuilt market forces. There's no reason to expect that to correct it, and that's why you need the government to come in and run deficits and blah blah blah. In contrast, Garrison's saying the monetarists. And so he's writing this in what did I say, 84. So at this point, like he has in mind, not just like old school monetarists like, Irving Fisher and Milton Friedman in the 60s or something, but he means like the rational expectations guys like Robert Lucas and stuff like that, in the early 80s, that they were coming up with models of, they were calling like the real business cycle theory and stuff, where it was like, oh, everything's just a shock. And it's like, yeah, there's a shock to labor productivity or whatever. And what we perceive as a recession is actually the optimal response to this new shock. And so there's really no, there's nothing for the market to fix. Like, this is the optimal thing to do. Right. And so Garrison thought that's also not compelling. Like, no, like we've talked about this before, I think, Adam, where in the 1930s, like the Keynesians hearing of the real business cycle theorists, they would mock them and say, oh, yeah, so in the 1930s, it wasn't the Great Depression, it was the Great Vacation. Because the idea is like, oh, everyone just optimally, because their productivity was lower, decided to consume more leisure. That's not an unfair way to explain if you were going to do a hardcore real business cycle theory explanation of the 30s, right? And so Garrison agreed that's silly. And so he's saying, oh, the Austrians, he thought, had the best of both worlds. And so this last thing I'll say, then we'll get to Garrison, I promise, folks. The Keynesians tend to focus just on money, right? And they're saying, oh, if there's insufficient demand, we need to have more spending. Like, that's the issue. Whereas the Chicago school, rational expectations, real business cycle guys, they tended to focus just on, quote, real factors. That's why it's called real business cycle theory. And they didn't care about, because, oh, money in the long run is neutral. Who cares? Like, prices just adjust. The quantity of money can't, explain real output or whatever. It's not like the way to make Bangladesh richer than the U.S. is to give the Bangladesh people more money. That's stupid, right? So from that mindset, they were saying, yeah, if the economy is underproducing or whatever, it's just because real factors must have changed. So it was like the Chicago guys just focused on real factors. And in that world, there really can't be a recession unless it's caused by genuine productivity, technological, fundamental things that the government can't fix anyway. And so Garrison was saying the Austrians, in his view, combined the best of both, or the truth in both, because their theory was one of the business cycle was a real one, like there were, their actual genuine malinvestments. And then once those occurred, there was physical ramifications. You can't just get out of recession by printing money. That won't work. But what caused the unsustainable boom were monetary factors. So it involved money, but also real elements. And he thought, and what was cool, of course, is Mises did that in 1912, right? It's not like Mises read the Keynesians and read the real business cycle theorists, and then in 1984 came up with his unified approach. No, Mises, before any of those schools existed, wrote the correct theory, we think. So let me stop. I've been saying a lot. Before we go in this diagram, do you want to respond to any of that?
No, I think that's all pretty clear. Just want to underscore why many people think that Mises is the greatest economist of them all. I think that time element has a lot to do with it. Also, his much underappreciated philosophical underpinnings, which I appreciate especially, and I know you do too.
Yes. Okay. So, with all that prelude or preface, so here Garrison distilled the Austrian theory of the boom bust cycle, he was trying to present it in a way that mainstream neoclassical economists would at least understand what the claims were and they could grapple with it. So in this diagram, you start at the lower right and then you move up and then you move left is the way to read this thing. And if you're in the car or the treadmill or something, just forget it. It's hopeless. You just have to come back and watch the YouTube on this one. So the bottom right and the top right diagrams are mainstream, those come from mainstream textbooks. The one to the top left isn't, but it's relatively simple. Okay. So the bottom right, that's what's called a loanable funds diagram. The y-axis is the interest rate and the x-axis is savings and investment. That's why they got the S, I, and the little I stands for, the interest rate. All right, so you have a supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds. So the supply of loanable funds, is upward sloping. The higher the interest rate, the more people want to save and the more funds available to lend out, right? That makes sense. That would be, as interest rates go higher, people would save more and be willing to lend more, measured in money terms. And then the demand for loanable funds is downward sloping, right? That the lower the interest rate, the higher the quantity of loans people want to take out to go do stuff with, right? So at the original, supply and demand, you got the intersection there, and then you look over left, that's the natural rate of interest. So that's thing originally, the thing consistent with intertemporal preferences and technology, blah, blah, blah. That is the sustainable natural rate of interest. So then what happens now if we want to set up an unsustainable boom is the banking system, perhaps because there's a central bank that injects more reserves or whatever, but we remain agnostic for the moment. But if there's an injection of new money into the loan market, then that shifts the supply of loanable funds to the right. So there you see it's the S, which is like the genuine savings, plus now that delta in the money supply. And so that shifts the supply of loanable funds to the right now, because for any given interest rate now, you have how much is the community saving out of its income, but now the banking system wants to lend out this, that delta M more. And that's true of any interest rate, so that's why the whole thing just shifts to the right. So what does that do? It has two effects. It lowers the interest rate, right? Because now to move a higher quantity of funds for the same demand curve, you got to have a lower interest rate. And then it also increases the quantity of funds that are invested, right? So then now you move up and you're going to relay various points on that diagram to the thing on the top right, and that's what's called a production possibilities frontier, or a PPF. And that's a very simple diagram that's supposed to just show the trade-offs, like the frontier of what types of production outcomes are physically possible at any given time, given our technology and the resources available to us. And so here he's just got sometimes like you'll do like a guns and butter is a popular one to show, if we want to have more guns, well then we have to have less butter, and vice versa, to show the trade-off between those two sectors.
So do you want to tell the folks what the X and Y axes on this one are?
Yes. The X-axis here is consumption goods, and the Y-axis is consumption goods, and the X-axis is investment goods.
Right.
Okay, so like I said, the bottom right, like you're thinking in money terms, and here he's trying to make that correspond to the physical manifestation. Okay, so the curve there, if you're looking at this, between the C and the I, is showing that's the sustainable. If preferences change or whatever, society, we can tilt more towards consumption goods, things like, TV sets, restaurant meals, sports cars, whatever, designer clothing, or we can make fewer consumption goods and make more investment goods, right? So you're moving along that axis because it has that shape. Necessarily, there's a trade-off between the two. If you want to have more investment goods, you got to have fewer consumption, or vice versa. Investment goods would be things like, 18-wheelers, interstate highways, factories, telescopes, stuff like that, hammers, things that don't directly give you utility, as a consumer, but are tools and whatever that make productivity higher to give more consumption down the road. That's what an investment good is. Okay, so the idea is anywhere on that thing is sustainable, but what ends up happening is, what Garrison's trying to pick with this diagram is that when there's an unsustainable boom and when the interest rates drop because of this injection of new money, not because there's genuinely been more extra saving, but just because now new money flows into the banking system and it gets lent out and pushes down interest rates, that it sets up these two opposing forces, that society is trying to consume more at the same time and businesses are investing to produce more investment goods. So if there were he doesn't have it here, but he first goes through and uses these diagrams to show what would a sustainable expansion look like. And he says, what if, if people save more out of their income, that would shift the supply curve of savings to the right. The natural rate of interest would genuinely fall, right? They would be like the new natural rate that would be lower. And then the households would consume less in the short term. So consumption would drop, investment goods would increase, and then over time that PPF would expand outward at a faster rate because now there's a higher investment rate. But in the short term, consumption falls, right? So he's showing you can expand the PPF, you can have a lower interest rate, you can have more investment spending, but the households need to cut back to make that sustainable. Where here you're trying to do both the same. Households are trying to consume more because interest rates are lower. Oh, I can, spend more on my credit card or whatever. It's cheaper. Or they, what's the flip side? They save less because interest rates are lower. But businesses at the lower rates now are trying to borrow more and invest more. Okay, so that's why you see on that top right diagram, like the arrow, like it moves up and then kind of turns around and comes back in. So what he's showing there is society, the aggregate production of society temporarily goes above the PPF, the production possibilities frontier. That's what, it doesn't just move along it shoots upward to the right, which means, consumption and investment have gone up temporarily. And the idea is you can do that in the short term. You can just think of things like imagine all the 18-wheelers, that are in service at any given time. In order to keep that up and running at any given time, you got to have some of them, in the shop getting repaired and whatever. You just get the oil changed and the tires rotated and blah, blah, blah. If you absolutely wanted to, and you had like a 1 month period where we absolutely need to have more shipping than we normally do, you could squeeze that out of the fleet, right? I mean,
Yep.
Trucks that were normally scheduled to go get maintenance, you can just say, no, just keep them running.
Get a few more miles right now.
Go to the warehouse because we got the aliens are going to attack us in 2 weeks. We got to get ready. Forget about maintenance, right? So the point is that PPF shows the sustainable combinations of consumer and investment good output. You could temporarily move beyond that, but you're eating the seed corn if you do that. And so that's why then it collapses and goes below it, because once you can see the seed corn, even if you go back to your normal routine, you can't. Like you gotta like tighten your belt for a bit to grow back to where it used to be.
Yeah, we all learned about this at an early age watching those Wile E. Coyote cartoons where he runs off the cliff and continues to go for a little while until base reality finally drags him back to the bottom of the ravine.
Yep. Okay, so if you're with me, folks, don't worry, we're almost done here, but let me just and if if you're really looking at the thing, how it lines up is he's showing that like faded circle that's still on the thing. He's showing that's how much investment they think they should be getting, because that lines up. If you drop that vertical line down, that's the new intersection of the supply of loanable funds with the injection of the new money. So that's how much like the entrepreneurs are trying to invest. They're trying to produce that much physically of investment goods, but then consumption tries to go up too, because the households aren't saving as much and they're spending more in consumer goods because interest rates are lower. And so then you draw those over to the left and you can see, so this stages of production, this is the Rothbardian diagram that we looked at before, but Garrison just rotated it. And incidentally, Rothbard took that and adapted it from Hayek in his book Prices and Production. right? So Hayek went to the London School of Economics in the early 30s, gave a series of lectures on prices and production, like, what we call the Austrian theory of the business cycle. And so the work, prices, and production came out that was like capturing his lectures. I think he edited it and stuff. It wasn't just a verbatim transcript. But Rothbard took that and just, tried to clean it up a little bit and make it easier for the lay reader. So what Garrison did is he just took that and rotated it. So here, the left-hand side is the start, is like harvesting the wheat or, mining. And then you move a little bit to the right, and then that's processing a little bit to the right, and that's, wholesale manufacturing a little bit to the right. That's, wholesaling and giving it, driving it to the warehouses. And then finally, the furthest thing to the right is the consumption side. So that triangle that's moving up is like the expansion of the rightward rectangles in Rothbard's diagram. And so like the 100 of the bread on this thing would be on that right axis, just going from, the bottom point straight up to the top of that triangle. That would be 100, And so you got the original diagram triangle there, which is like normal. And then what happens when the interest rate gets lowered is the triangle gets pulled in two opposite directions. Then on the one hand, at the lower interest rate, entrepreneurs want to invest in earlier stage projects because now at the lower, instead of the interest rate being 5%, now it's 3%. Things that take more stages to come to fruition now become profitable because of the lower interest rate. You can have your funds tied up for longer. And so that's why investment's now happening further from consumption. So that's why it's moving. The triangle's getting pulled to the left. But on the other hand, the consumers are trying to consume more. So they're spending more on consumption goods. So like there's a scramble to produce more consumption on the right side of that triangle. And so the point is, like, the triangle's getting pulled both ways, and it's just physically unsustainable.
Yep.
All right. So in that PPF diagram, the top right, how he shows it, it briefly goes above the thing and then turns and crashes. In the triangle, that's depicted by, the triangle getting pulled to the left, but also getting pulled up. And now, well, that's not sustainable. And so, but it gives the intuition that there can be a few periods where there seems to be prosperity. The consumers really are consuming more. It's not an illusion. They really are getting more television sets and blah, blah, blah. And entrepreneurs really are starting, they're building new factories and things, making stuff that has never been made before at that earlier stage. So everything looks great. But the problem is with that, as the stuff's marching along the pipeline now, we don't have enough total resources to carry it to fruition. And so but again, there's the time lag. And again, that circular flow diagram, you wouldn't be able to depict that. But whereas when you have in mind that stage of production, you can see how it's at least possible. Oh yeah, stuff gets out of whack. It might take a few periods to be obvious. And so that's what Garrison's trying to capture here.
Mises uses the idea of a master builder and bricks. If you were going to stick with the production of bread analogy, is there a way you could say it in a memorable way?
It would, this might be a bit contrived, but it would be something like if they realized there were land that was more arable, but it was like on some island somewhere, and so it took longer. Like, we got to build some ships, and we're going to go and plant the seeds, on this other island where because of the sunlight and whatever. We're going to get much higher harvest per acre, but now it takes longer. And then we're also building new ovens and stuff, and we're going to be able to make more, and they're doing all this stuff, but like, there's just not enough to, there's going to be a gap. Like, because now we didn't plant normally, and we took half the seeds and went and took 2 periods to put it on the ship to go to this island where the sunlight's been and the soil's better. But now there's going to be a gap, and we're going to run out of the flour that was moving up the chain. Now there's going to be a lag because, we were supposed to get new wheat, but now we're only going to get a trickle because the farmers who normally would plant, they gave most of their seeds to these guys who went on this adventure. And we don't have that, we don't have the wheat from that yet. And so now there's going to be this gap moving up the thing.
Would the producers see this coming as the prices of these input goods start to rise? Because consumers are bidding them away at the same that they're bidding for them. And so the prices are like, why are these prices rising? I don't know.
Right. And that explains too, like you say, well, how can there be more loaves of bread? I mean, again, I can keep making up stuff to make this more and more contrived, but yes, as the consumers now have more money, and now they have 120 ounces of gold to go to the store, because it's not actually gold. It's like notes from banks that say this is worth 1 ounce of gold. And there's still only 100 ounces in the vaults, but now they printed up 20 more tickets or whatever. Yeah. And so, as the consumers are going, they push up the price of bread at the store, and that they're running low, and it's like, wow, at these prices, people want to buy whatever 1,000 loaves. We only have 800, so let's raise prices. But also, if there are ways that somebody can skimp and like take something that's 2 stages before and grab it and do something to it and make it into bread that maybe is not as good or something, but there are, there's different ways of making stuff. There's lots of technological recipes, and the idea is in the real world, as prices starts popping up in pockets here and there, people can run around and scramble and try to fulfill that. And you actually can get, as I said, with the, the deferring maintenance and stuff, there's lots of things where there is a trade-off that you can boost finished output temporarily at the cost of, there's going to be now a drop down the road. Like there's consequences of that.
I feel like I've asked you this before, but I can't remember the answer.
Yes.
Is there, perfect. Thank you. Is there an aggregate statistic somewhere in the government's Bureau of Statistics that would show the hollowed out capital structure in the country if we only were to look at it or to compare certain things over a time series in a way that just doesn't happen?
Yes, and it came from Jeffrey Epstein's vacation account, and it's just a bunch of black rectangles.
I knew it.
Yeah. The quick answer is no. There are different Austrians who have tried coming up with measures of this kind of stuff. So there's no clean. It's not like, everyone agrees. Yes, you would just go take, this particular metric and that's what you use. Part of the issue is these are all simplistic models. You know what I mean? Like we can use the bread as a metaphor or whatever. Or like I said, in Garrison's thing, he's got 5 sectors. It's like mining, some stuff, and then the finished one's retail, and wholesale's in there, and manufacturing's one. I think processing maybe is what he calls the second one after mining, something like that. But even because the other thing too is, for this, strictly speaking, it's got to be like the farmers don't use any tools. Like it's with their raw labor power, with their bare hands, they pull the wheat up. Because once they're using tractors, well now, wait a minute. Now it's a really sophisticated production process, because you got to go backwards in time for where those tractors come from. And ultimately you got to trace it back to the primitive guys coming out of the cave, and so anyway, that's one of the critiques of Bombeverkian capital theory, is like to really do it correctly. You got to go back to the beginning when it was just human labor and natural resources and no capital goods. But anyway, so you can see when you start getting more and more realistic how complicated it gets. I did a thing in grad school. We had to do an econometric paper, for our 3rd year class or something. And I did what you're talking about. I was trying to measure something like the response of various sectors to changes in interest rates. Because in the standard Austrian story, it's like, when the interest rate drops, that should goose consumer spending, but it should really goose like early stage investment, because the rollover of time is more. And so I was trying to test it. And, that's like what Mises and Rothbard stuff talk about is feathers in the cap of the Austrian business cycle theory, is that, it is true in the normal boom bust cycle, like the mining sectors respond much more aggressively than the retail sectors do, like in terms of the swings and stuff. And so they thought, it all makes sense. So I did try to quantify that. I got the data and blah, 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 and I went through and I did it, and it worked. You know what I mean? Like it did what it was supposed to. But I joked to my friend, I said, if it had come out the other way, I still would have believed in Austrian theory. And I said, this is stupid, but for whatever you want to take it for, it did work. That the mining sector was more sensitive to interest rate changes than, retail spending was.
Good stuff. You have any final comments you want to make about these two great men?
So I would say this: if you've been intrigued and you're like, I kind of want to get more to this, but geez, these books are daunting. for Rothbard, I'm just going to say what I did. I think the first thing I read from him was it's a collection called Making Economic Sense. And it's a collection of his essays that are, as the title suggests, just about economics, right? Because there's another collection the Institute has called The Irrepressible Rothbard. And that has, I mean, that's a great collection, but he's given movie reviews and he's talking about Pat Buchanan, and you know what I mean? Whereas Making Economic Sense is just all about economic stuff. So if you want to, get into Austrian economics, I would suggest that first, because it's, they're shorter essays that, 3-4 pages each to get digested. And Rothbard's a very clear writer.
Yeah.
So I would start with that. And then if you like that, go ahead and read Man, Economy, and State and use my study guide to help you. So, just Google Robert Murphy Study Guide, Man, Economy, and State. You'll get the PDF for free at Mises. And then for Garrison, if you're in grad school or you have been to grad school for economics, you can get his time and money, but that's the level that is. I think I used that as a textbook for like Austrian 2 or something when I was at the undergrad level. But I mean, Garrison's book is tougher. It's not for the layperson. But look at his PowerPoint presentation. Like look at one of the things like Garrison did it at Mises U a bunch of times.
Yeah.
So just watch one of those, and they did a good job of integrating, like from you watching, you're not just seeing it in the distance. Like they, make it the full view of what the PowerPoint's doing. I would watch that. I think you're gonna have a good understanding of the Austrian theory.
Absolutely. Good stuff. Thank you. Let me lean on your big brain and knowledge of economics and all like that. For me, folks, please go to HeymanNature.com. That's where my Substack is. I'm Adam Heyman, Haman. And also check out my YouTube, just in case you're watching this on Bob's, Heyman Nature at YouTube. Bob, where would you like to send folks out of all the many, many, many things you do?
So at YouTube, and again, I've been instructed to tell people, it really does help, apparently, people. So, if you like the show, just go and subscribe and all that. So there's a reason all your favorite podcasters say that. It helps with the algorithm. So YouTube, it's at Bob Murphy and Cap. That's technically what my channel's title is or whatever. And then on Twitter, I'm Bob Murphy Econ.
Yeah, if you don't know Bob Murphy's Twitter game, you're missing out on one of the joys in life. All right. Thanks again, Bob. That was awesome. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We will catch you next time.
So long, folks.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.